The initial weeks of internment unfolded in a hushed tension within the American prisoner of war camp. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, fresh from battle and surrender, passed through the barbed wire. Their uniforms, caked with sweat and grime from relentless marches across dusty island roads, bore testament to months of brutal combat under the unforgiving tropical sun. Exhaustion weighed heavy on their bodies, yet nothing could have prepared them for the bewildering scene that awaited them. Following registration, medical evaluations, and the distribution of basic necessities, they were directed into a vast wooden structure. Overhead, a network of pipes crisscrossed the ceiling. Many stopped dead in their tracks. This building bore no resemblance to anything they had encountered in the Pacific. Wide rows of metal nozzles, each with a drain beneath, protruded from the lines. American guards, efficient and no-nonsense, gestured for them to disrobe and form a line. It was then, for the first time, that many understood. They weren't merely being held. They were expected to wash. Confusion rippled through the ranks of the prisoners. For Japanese soldiers during the war, bathing was an infrequent luxury, often improvised in rivers or at sea, and always constrained by severe shortages. Soap was practically unheard of. Yet here, under the watchful eyes of their sworn enemy, they were being led towards an organized ritual of cleansing. Some clutched their meager belongings, wary of a trick. Whispers spread, nervous and hushed, about the steam rising from the pipes. They recalled the terrifying tales spun by their officers before their capture, that Americans were savage, that surrender meant utter humiliation, that prisoners would face treatment worse than animals. Now, staring at the gleaming metal showers, they wondered if this was some insidious form of cruelty. The guards, growing impatient with their hesitation, barked orders in English and gestured again. Shoes, belts, tunics, all had to be removed. One by one, reluctant hands unfastened buttons, revealing bodies scarred by jungle campaigns, exposed and vulnerable before strangers and one another. They felt stripped bare, humiliated. Still, they obeyed, gripping the unfamiliar bars of soap pressed into their palms. Then came the hiss of water. From the overhead pipes, streams of clean, hot liquid gushed forth. The sudden warmth startled them. For an instant, they froze, bracing for pain. Instead, as the water cascaded down their backs and shoulders, washing away layers of grime, a strange calm enveloped them. Some closed their eyes, letting the dirt swirl into the drains. Others cautiously rubbed with the rough soap, as if testing whether such an indulgence was truly permitted. Slowly, the initial fear dissolved into quiet awe. They hadn't felt such sustained heat and freshness in months, even years. In the islands where they had fought, water was rationed, showers non-existent, and lice and disease rampant. To step beneath a continuous stream of hot water, free from buckets, shouting officers, or restrictions, was an almost unthinkable luxury. Here, in enemy hands, they were cleaner than they had ever been in their own army barracks. When they emerged, towels awaited them. Thick cotton towels, neatly stacked. Many prisoners touched them as if they were artifacts from another world. They dried their bodies awkwardly, unaccustomed to such fabric. For the Americans, this was standard camp procedure. For the Japanese, it was a revelation. They shuffled out, hair dripping, skin pink from the warmth, a palpable murmur of astonishment passing among them. The fear that had gripped them upon entering the shower hall had been replaced by bewilderment. Had their captors truly offered them comfort instead of cruelty? That first encounter with the camp showers etched itself into their minds, lingering long after. It marked the beginning of a series of discoveries that challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. The experience wasn't merely about washing away dirt. It was about confronting the stark difference between what they had been told and what they now lived. The modern shower, with its endless hot water and soap, became a symbol of something much larger. The dawning realization that captivity might not mean degradation, but an unexpected glimpse into another civilization's way of life. When the first round of showers concluded and the prisoners filed back into the barracks, a heavy silence settled over the room. They sat on wooden benches, some clutching their folded uniforms, others gently rubbing their hair with the thick towels, still unsure if they had experienced a blessing or a veiled threat. Many avoided eye contact, as if speaking openly might shatter some unspoken rule. Yet deep inside, unease gnawed at them. They had been warned countless times. Capture by Americans meant dishonor, torture, and death. In whispered briefings before battles, Japanese officers had painted chilling images of sadistic enemy camps where starvation and abuse awaited. Yet here, the very first act forced upon them was bathing with soap and hot water. To many, it seemed suspicious, too kind, too civilized. One prisoner, a former naval mechanic from Yokosuka, recalled Allied propaganda leaflets depicting smiling prisoners of war receiving food and rest. He had always dismissed those images as lies, designed solely to undermine Japanese morale. Now standing clean for the first time in months, he remembered those illustrations with a chill. Could some of them have been true? But another thought, darker and more terrifying, crept into his mind. What if the showers weren't for cleanliness at all? Rumors circulated swiftly, especially among those with sharper memories of wartime propaganda. Some whispered the words gas chambers, drawing vague comparisons to stories they'd heard about the Germans in Europe. Though few knew details, the idea that Americans might use showers for some hidden cruelty spread rapidly in hushed tones. The guards observed the hesitation. They watched groups of prisoners pause at the doorways, their faces clouded with mistrust. Orders were repeated, and translators explained in broken Japanese that bathing was simply mandatory hygiene. But suspicion did not vanish easily. For men trained to believe surrender was a fate worse than death, any act of comfort carried the bitter taste of deception. They wondered if the soap they were given was poisoned, if the warmth of the water concealed something sinister. Some even refused to wash thoroughly, merely wetting their arms and backs before stepping away. The cultural clash amplified the jarring nature of the moment. In Japan, bathing possessed deep cultural roots, intertwined with ritual purification in hot springs and shared communal baths. But war had stripped away that tradition, leaving soldiers unwashed for weeks, crawling with lice, battling constant infections. The camp showers, in stark contrast, were industrial in design, rows of steel pipes and drains, efficient, devoid of privacy, operating with clockwork precision. To the Americans, this was practical hygiene, nothing more. To the Japanese, it felt alien, mechanical, almost dehumanizing. A ritual stripped of its spiritual meaning, transformed into something functional yet profoundly unsettling. For days, conversations among the prisoners revolved around the same questions. Why would the Americans waste hot water on captives? Why provide soap, towels, and time when they could have simply left them filthy? Was it truly generosity, or part of some larger plan to break them mentally? Theories multiplied in the dimly lit barracks. Some argued the showers were a form of control, a way to weaken resistance by softening men with comfort. Others whispered about hidden chemicals mixed into the water. Fear clung to them, reinforced by memories of their superiors' warnings. Yet, no punishment followed. No hidden cruelty emerged. The men returned to the barracks at night, still breathing, still alive, cleaner than before. Slowly, suspicion began to erode, replaced by a quieter, reluctant curiosity. The Americans repeated the process the next day and the day after that. Soap continued to be distributed. Guards ensured every man entered the shower hall. And still, nothing terrible happened. Suspicion remained, but now it mingled with another feeling: confusion. What kind of enemy would care if their prisoners smelled clean or carried fewer lice? For men raised to believe capture was a fate worse than death, this realization was as unsettling as the showers themselves. Don't forget to subscribe to World War II Files. The daily rhythm of hygiene soon integrated itself into camp life, though initially it felt imposed upon the Japanese prisoners. Each morning or evening, according to schedule, guards lined them up and marched them to the shower hall. At the entrance, they received soap, wrapped in paper, smelling strongly of chemicals unlike anything from home, and towels, often marked with military supply stamps. The routine was mechanical. Strip, step under the streams, wash thoroughly, dry, dress, and return. But as days turned into weeks, the prisoners began to understand that this was no temporary measure. Cleanliness was a rule, a discipline enforced just as firmly as curfews and roll calls. The Americans explained hygiene standards through interpreters, gesturing to demonstrate proper soap usage, insisting that men scrub not only their arms and faces, but their feet, their hair, and the hidden folds of the body. Lice checks followed, carried out by medics who meticulously inspected clothing seams and bedding. Delousing powder was issued along with clean undergarments. For the first time, many Japanese soldiers realized that the enemy treated disease prevention as seriously as they treated food or weapons. To the Americans, hygiene was not a luxury, but a necessity for order, health, and discipline within the camp. For the prisoners, this routine carried a strange mixture of humiliation and fascination. On one hand, they were stripped of individuality, compelled to wash on command like schoolboys. On the other, they discovered that a life free from constant itching, sores, and infected wounds was surprisingly tolerable. A corporal who had fought on Guadalcanal remembered weeks when his unit bathed only once in muddy streams, while tropical ulcers spread relentlessly among his comrades. In stark contrast, after just a few weeks of enforced showers, the sores on his legs began to heal, and the chronic cough that plagued him faded. It was a quiet, undeniable improvement, an irony that gnawed at his pride. Language barriers caused endless confusion in the beginning. Many prisoners didn't understand when guards shouted about washing hair or scrubbing feet, so they did the bare minimum. When they tried to skip steps, they were forced back under the streams, watched impatiently until the soap lathered properly. Some resented the interference, muttering that it was degrading. Yet even in their resistance, they couldn't deny the results. Their uniforms, laundered regularly by camp procedures, no longer carried the foul stench of rotting cloth. Blankets smelled faintly of detergent instead of sweat and mildew. The barracks, once suffocating with the odor of unwashed bodies, grew more tolerable, even for those who never admitted it aloud. Gradually, the sense of suspicion gave way to habit. Prisoners began to anticipate the routine, lining up with less resistance. They learned to scrub more thoroughly, to dry themselves with care, to fold the towels as instructed. Some even compared soap types, noting which ones lathered better or smelled less harsh. It was a small detail, but for men stripped of freedom, such comparisons became a form of conversation, a way to fill long hours of idleness. Hygiene had transformed from a command into a shared ritual, something that quietly bound them together. What struck many most deeply was the realization that their captors expected them to maintain dignity, even in captivity. To be forced into showers and provided with soap was not only about controlling disease, it was about enforcing a certain standard of humanity. In the Japanese army, soldiers had been taught that comfort was weakness, that endurance of filth and pain was a mark of honor. Now, under the discipline of their enemy, they were shown that regular washing could be as much a part of discipline as carrying a rifle. This clash of values unsettled them, but it also sowed the first seeds of reluctant respect for the strange, relentless order of their captors. The first time hot water cascaded over their shoulders, many Japanese prisoners gasped, some even stepping back as though scalded. Warmth, steady and controlled, poured from the overhead nozzles in a way they had never experienced before. For men accustomed to makeshift washing in cold rivers or hastily filled buckets, the sensation was almost luxurious. The steam rose quickly, curling through the air and softening the harsh light of the barrack-style room. The soap, pungent and foreign, foamed thickly on their skin, lifting away months of grime. They rubbed it tentatively at first, then with more vigor, marveling at the way the lather clung and rinsed away with ease. For some, the moment was overwhelming. They remembered how, during long campaigns in the jungles, officers had warned them to conserve every drop of water, that cleanliness was secondary to survival. On remote islands, baths were rare. Soldiers wiped themselves with rags, their skin perpetually sticky with sweat, salt, and dust. The few occasions when hot water could be heated in cans or drums were considered rare blessings, shared among dozens of men. Here, however, each prisoner stood under his own stream of warmth, as though such luxury were endless. It was not simply bathing. It was immersion in another world. The towels provided afterward deepened the shock. Thick and absorbent, they were unlike the thin cloth soldiers had once used in Japanese barracks, where men often had to share rags. Prisoners pressed the towels to their faces, inhaling the faint chemical scent of detergent. Their skin felt renewed, pores open, the sticky film of the tropics finally washed away. It was more than physical relief. It stirred emotions they had long suppressed. Some recalled family baths back home, memories of mothers drawing hot water in tubs before the war consumed their lives. Others thought of public bathhouses, now distant echoes of a civilian past. The camp showers reawakened those sensations, but now framed by the strangeness of captivity. The Americans treated the routine without sentiment, issuing soap and towels with the same blunt efficiency as rations. For them, it was procedure, disease prevention, morale management, order. Yet to the prisoners, it became a quiet revelation. The irony was bitter. They had expected cruelty, yet here they encountered comfort beyond what they had known, even among their own forces. Some felt shame, believing such indulgence weakened them. Others embraced it silently, grateful for a moment that allowed their aching bodies to feel human again. Over time, the showers reshaped their daily existence. Instead of scratching at lice or ignoring festering sores, they learned that hot water soothed pain and sped healing. Their hair, once greasy and matted, grew soft and easier to comb. The smell of sweat that had clung to their uniforms diminished, replaced by the faint sharpness of disinfectant soap. Even the barracks' air became lighter, less suffocating, as regular bathing reduced the odors of so many bodies living in confinement. Prisoners began to notice these changes with astonishment, quietly acknowledging that they were healthier than they had been during combat. The paradox gnawed at their minds. How could the enemy, whom they had been taught to despise, provide them with care that their own army had denied? The showers were not just about cleanliness. They were proof of a system so organized, so abundant in resources, that it could extend comfort even to captives. Standing under the streams of hot water, They could not help but feel both envy and unease. It was a reminder of how different this world was from the one they had left behind, and how far Japan lagged behind in offering such basic dignity to its own soldiers. At night, when the barracks dimmed and the long rows of prisoners lay on their bunks, conversations often drifted back to comparisons with their former lives in the Imperial Army. The subject was not weapons, not battles, but the strange discovery of hygiene. Men who had marched across Burma, who had fought in the jungles of the Philippines, now whispered about soap, towels, and the shock of hot water. It was not the sort of topic soldiers had ever considered honorable, but the contrast was too striking to ignore. In the Japanese military, bathing had been a rare event, carried out only when circumstances allowed. Officers spoke of endurance, of ignoring the body's discomfort, of embracing filth as a sign of toughness. Soldiers often went weeks without washing, their skin layered with grime, their uniforms stiff with salt from dried sweat. Lice and fleas infested clothing seams. Tropical ulcers spread, untreated. The stench of unwashed bodies clung to every march, every camp, every night in the field. To complain about it was seen as weakness, unworthy of a true warrior. Yet in these American camps, cleanliness was enforced, as though it were a law equal to discipline itself. One prisoner, a former sergeant, recalled aloud how his unit on New Guinea had shared a single rusty basin of water for 30 men. They had rinsed their faces and hands, but there had been no question of real bathing. He compared it bitterly to the endless streams of hot water in captivity. Another man muttered that back in Manchuria, his regiment had suffered frostbite, not only from cold, but from wearing the same unwashed socks for months. Disease had crippled entire units more effectively than bullets. Now, here in America, every man scrubbed his feet daily, and medics checked for infection as if they were valued patients. The irony was so sharp that it stung. This recognition spread quietly through the camp. Even those who clung to pride could not deny that their bodies were improving. Rashes faded, lice disappeared, sores healed. Stomachs that had once twisted from parasites now settled with regular washing and cleaner clothes. Prisoners began to connect these improvements with the routines they had once resisted. For the first time, they understood that hygiene was not softness. It was strength, a weapon against disease more powerful than stubborn endurance. The reflections were not only physical, but cultural. Many remembered the deep traditions of communal baths in Japan, onsen in the mountains, wooden tubs in village homes. Bathing had once been part of life, tied to family and ritual. War had stripped it away, reducing men to creatures surviving in dirt. Now, in captivity, the enemy had returned to them what their own army had denied. The paradox unsettled them. Some spoke of it with longing, remembering their mothers heating kettles in the evenings. Others fell silent, ashamed that it was not Japan, but America, that had restored this dignity. The guards did not understand the depth of this shock. For them, hygiene was practical, tied to regulations and public health. They issued orders without sentiment, never imagining that the routine showers carried such profound meaning for the prisoners. But within the wire fences, men lay awake, staring at the rafters, realizing that the very structure of military life they had known was flawed. It was not strength to endure filth. It was not honor to ignore disease. They began to wonder, if America cared this much for the health of captives, how much more must it care for its own soldiers? The thought was uncomfortable, yet impossible to silence. Weeks stretched into months, and the hygiene routine that once felt alien began to carve deep grooves into the rhythm of captivity. Every man knew the order of the day. Wake up, roll call, meals, and at scheduled intervals, the march to the shower hall. What had once been met with suspicion now became an almost unspoken expectation. The guards no longer needed to bark as loudly, and the prisoners no longer shuffled with such reluctance. They moved in steady lines, soap tucked into their palms, towels draped across their shoulders, as though it had always been this way. The transformation was not merely physical, but mental. The Japanese soldiers, stripped of their weapons and their cause, had regained something unexpected, a fragment of dignity. Their uniforms, laundered regularly, no longer carried the stench of decay. Their bodies, washed and examined, were free of lice and festering wounds. Even the mirror-like reflections in small puddles after rain revealed healthier faces, cheeks less gaunt, skin less scarred by sores. It was an improvement that none could deny, even if they never admitted it aloud. Cleanliness began to symbolize more than survival. It became proof that they had not been entirely reduced to shadows of men. The effects rippled through the barracks. Coughing diminished. The relentless scratching of lice-ridden scalps disappeared. Blankets smelled faintly of soap rather than mold. Guards remarked, sometimes with a smirk, that the Japanese prisoners looked more orderly than when they had first arrived. Some prisoners, embarrassed by this observation, still resisted internally, clinging to the belief that such routines were meant to soften them. Yet the truth was plain. They felt stronger. Their wounds healed faster, their sleep deepened, and their energy, though still bound by captivity, grew steadier. For some, this change stirred pride rather than shame. They began to fold their towels neatly after drying, to polish their boots with greater care, to keep the barracks swept and orderly. It reminded them of old traditions back home, of the meticulous rituals of Japanese households. Cleanliness, they realized, was not submission to the enemy. It was reclaiming fragments of themselves, fragments buried under the mud and chaos of war. Even conversations shifted. Men once too weary to speak now traded quiet remarks about the strangeness of feeling refreshed, about the irony that they were healthier in captivity than in the field. American medics, practical and unsentimental, kept records of the improvements. Fewer cases of dysentery, fewer infestations, fewer deaths. For the Americans, it was proof that the system worked. For the Japanese, it was an awakening. They could not help but notice that their captors treated hygiene as a matter of discipline and respect, not a privilege, but a requirement. This lesson unsettled them because it contrasted so sharply with their own military ethos, where endurance of filth was a badge of honor. Here, the opposite was true. Cleanliness was order, and order was strength. Over time, the suspicion that had once clung to the showers eroded almost entirely. Men no longer whispered about poison in the soap or hidden cruelty behind the water pipes. Instead, they began to anticipate the warmth, even to crave it. The ritual became something to look forward to, a moment of physical relief in a life otherwise stripped of freedom. Some prisoners lingered under the streams longer than allowed, closing their eyes and letting the water cascade over them, as if washing away not only dirt, but memories of defeat. In the quiet of those routines, many discovered that hygiene was more than a rule enforced by guards. It was a restoration of dignity, a way to feel human again, even within the barbed wire. It was a subtle, undeniable transformation, one that changed not only their bodies, but their very sense of what it meant to endure. By the time autumn winds swept across the camp and the days shortened, the conversations among the prisoners had shifted. No longer whispered debates about hidden poison or disguised cruelty. The talk now revolved around a different kind of astonishment. The realization that these daily rituals of soap, hot water, and towels were not accidents of captivity, but symbols of something larger. In the dim barracks where men sat cross-legged on their bunks, they began to tell each other stories of their first encounters with the showers, laughing awkwardly at their own fear and marveling at how routine it had all become. One prisoner, once a stern infantry officer, confessed that when he first stepped into the steaming chamber, he thought it was a trick designed to kill them. The others chuckled at the memory, shaking their heads, though many admitted they had felt the same unease. Another man, younger and more talkative, compared the camp showers to the great public bathhouses in Tokyo he had visited as a boy. The comparison stirred murmurs of nostalgia, the prisoners momentarily transported back to a world of tiled floors and wooden buckets, to evenings when families and neighbors shared warmth together. The irony struck them all. It was in enemy hands that fragments of those memories returned. What unsettled them most was not the showers themselves, but what they revealed about America. If this country had enough resources to maintain endless hot water for its prisoners, what must it provide for its own soldiers? If soap and towels were distributed here so freely, what luxuries must be waiting on bases back home? The contrast with their own experience gnawed at them. They remembered comrades who died from infection because there was no clean water to wash wounds, soldiers who marched with lice eating into their scalps, men who wasted away not only from hunger, but from the slow destruction of their bodies by dirt and disease. To realize that the enemy placed such emphasis on hygiene made many prisoners quietly admit, though never too loudly, that perhaps this was one of the secrets of American strength. Conversations grew more open around the mess hall tables while eating rations of bread, potatoes, or beans. Some spoke openly of their shock. They admitted that before capture, they had imagined Americans as brutal beasts. Instead, they discovered them to be orderly, methodical, even in something as mundane as bathing. Others took it further, suggesting that this reflected an entire civilization built on abundance and efficiency, one that had the luxury to extend such practices even to its enemies. These ideas sparked debates, for not all prisoners wanted to admit such uncomfortable truths. Pride still lingered, and many bristled at the suggestion that America was superior. Yet the evidence of their own clean skin, their healed sores, their improved health, was undeniable. For some, the realization turned bitter. They muttered that this comfort was designed to weaken them, to strip them of the endurance that once defined Japanese soldiers. Others, however, felt something different, a reluctant respect. They began to view the showers not merely as hygiene, but as a window into the vast resources, the industrial might, and the different philosophy of their captors. In hushed tones, a few even admitted that the experience had changed how they imagined the world beyond the wire. Thus, the showers, once feared as instruments of cruelty, became centers of revelation. They were no longer only about soap and water. They were about the stark contrast between two worlds, and the realization that their enemy's power rested not only in weapons, but in systems of life so advanced that even prisoners of war were swept into their discipline. Years later, when many of the Japanese prisoners returned home after the war's end, the memory of captivity remained complex, marked by shame, relief, and confusion. Yet among the countless impressions carved into their minds, one image persisted with startling clarity: the showers. Men who had fought on distant islands, who had seen comrades fall in jungle ambushes and naval bombardments, remembered above all the sensation of hot water pouring from pipes, the soap foaming in their hands, the enforced rhythm of cleanliness that had first unsettled and then transformed them. Some former prisoners spoke of it to their families, awkwardly describing how the Americans had insisted on daily hygiene. Their wives and mothers listened in disbelief. How could an enemy provide such care? Others remained silent, reluctant to admit that captivity had offered comforts greater than those their own army had granted. Yet in private, many acknowledged that the hygiene standards of the camps had altered their perception of the world. The memory of endless hot water stood as proof of a civilization different from their own, modern, abundant, and organized in ways that Japan, despite its discipline and tradition, could not match during the war years. The recollection was not sentimental. For the prisoners, showers had been strange, humiliating, even frightening at first, but time reshaped those feelings. As disease subsided, as wounds healed, as lice vanished, the association grew stronger. Cleanliness equaled strength. They realized that health was not a luxury, but a weapon, one that America wielded silently yet effectively. In barracks conversations after repatriation, some admitted that this lesson was perhaps the greatest they carried home, not about military tactics, but about the power of modern living standards. Historians who later interviewed them noted how often showers appeared in their testimonies. Unlike food or work assignments, which varied from camp to camp, the routine of hygiene was nearly universal. It left an imprint deeper than rations of bread or cigarettes. Men who had endured starvation in the field could survive meager camp meals without surprise. But to be handed soap and towels, to be marched into steaming rooms of hot water, this was unforgettable because it was so utterly alien to their wartime experience. It symbolized not indulgence, but an entirely different worldview, one where the enemy recognized even captives as humans who must remain clean. The long-term impact lingered quietly. Some former prisoners, once settled back into civilian life, maintained the habits they had learned in captivity. They washed more regularly, insisting on soap even when scarce. They taught their children that hygiene was a discipline, not a weakness. For them, the camp showers had not been mere routines. They had been revelations, lessons carried across decades. In retrospect, the memory was bittersweet. It reminded them of defeat, of surrender, of being reduced to captives. But it also reminded them of survival, of unexpected dignity in the hands of an enemy they had been told to hate. For many, it was the paradox that defined their war, that in the very moment of humiliation, they had glimpsed a form of modernity they could not forget. The showers were not simply about water and soap. They were about discovering that cleanliness, order, and care, even in captivity, could alter the very way a man understood his place in the world.